So what I've chosen to talk about today is an extract from Zen's Eternal Life from Master Jiu's book. It's actually a quotation that I return to periodically. One of the things which, to my mind, made Master Jiu a good teacher is her background and experience in religious practice from early life. It's perhaps because of that she was able to understand the mindset of and the culture of Westerners and their approach to studying religion, the Dharma, and she adapted her teaching in a way that helped people to appreciate the Buddhist way, made it seem less foreign or alien. And she could also see the value of observing similarities between religions where they occurred. In other words, she used her knowledge of comparative religion so that her students came to understand that instead of being competing philosophies, other religions are simply alternative methods for seeking the truth. This approach, to me, exemplifies admirable tolerance and understanding, discourages parochialism and dogma. And so the passage which I really like from Zen's Eternal Life is where she references part of a sermon by Meister Eckhart. He was a German mystic who lived in the 13th and 14th centuries, and he occasionally courted controversy by challenging some of the accepted orthodoxy of the time. And rightly so, some would say, because his writings seem to reject God, whereas actually they were really pointing to a reality beyond the limits of the concept of a God. I.e., he had a deep understanding, one which went beyond the kind of Sunday school doctrines which many students of Christianity find hard to let go. And I think it's to Master Jiu's credit that she acknowledged this. She recognized that in our terms he knew true nature. He knew shunyata, emptiness. So the quotation goes like this. In the passage where she's talking about nirvana, as the bodhisattva proceeds through the stages to Buddhahood, he or she gradually realizes that nirvana is a state of mind resulting from right effort towards true spiritual perfection rather than a reward in the hereafter, as it's sometimes been described. This state of mind has perhaps best been described by Meister Eckhart in the words, quotes, "And a man shall be free and as pure as the day prior to his entry into his mother's womb, when he has nothing, wants nothing, and knows nothing. Such a one has true spiritual poverty." End quote. This is when compassionate awareness, or compassionate oneness, has so transcended all thought of self that not even the oneness exists. So just by being a bodhisattva, one is already in nirvana. So I've chosen to talk today about having nothing, knowing nothing, and wanting nothing, which is not only a beautiful expression of nirvana, it also describes meditation perfectly, and also the enlightened mind. It takes some contemplation, though, and getting behind the words to appreciate what is meant by those terms. Perhaps I should say also that the stages to Buddhahood, which Master Jiu refers to, is a bit of a misnomer. I'm sure she would agree with the suggestion that there aren't really stages. We've often heard that in our teaching, it's perhaps better described as a gradual refining or a falling away of egocentric thoughts and actions, which happens if you keep up the training. And spiritual poverty is a reference to the biblical verse many of you probably heard, which goes, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And already there you need a kind of a different definition or understanding of poverty, which is why we need to be careful in understanding the terms. Poverty is usually regarded as a bad thing, of course. We normally use it in connection with suffering deprivation of something. So it's something to be avoided. But here it's linked to virtue. How can that be? And actually, what does spiritual mean? That word covers a pretty wide spectrum of ideas and concepts, some of which are fairly vague and obscurely metaphysical. But in this example, it alludes to the will. You might assume that spiritual poverty is about lacking in spiritually wholesome qualities. If you have poverty of spirit, then you have no spirit. That's not what it's about. So to attempt a definition, you could say spiritual poverty is being empty of self or free from willfulness. We talk of overcoming our egotistical will, and the Christians say that they aim to do God's will. Meister Eckhart says you have to go further than that and not even aim to do God's will, but in our terms, just to be still and respond to life. To have no egotistical motivation, but instead to allow your actions to be guided by the situation of the moment and the pure heart that we all possess. So we'll take having nothing, knowing nothing and wanting nothing in turn to kind of get behind those terms. Having nothing, of course, we all, or many people, try to amass possessions to acquire material wealth, because that's the worldly way of seeking satisfaction from life. And also we think freedom comes from being rich, because when you have money, people give you what you want, or they do what you ask them to. But of course that's not real freedom. Having nothing also means not being attached to a personality, or not having a fixed sense of the kind of person that we think we are. And actually the current pandemic has thrown this issue into relief, hasn't it? So many people, perhaps all of us, had plans and expectations for the year, which we've now been forced to drop or to modify significantly. It's really shown us something of the nature of the reality of human life, in that we are interdependent and also subject to changing conditions which are beyond our control. And the fact that many people aren't very well capable of accepting changes to their plans and expectations. We're seeing people resisting or protesting against the so-called lockdown because they feel they're being oppressed, and they attack the authorities. Of course, it's in everyone's interests that we all accept the recommended restrictions. So the fact they're objecting is evidence of their delusion, to be frank. Knowing nothing. knowledge makes us feel important, which is why we can easily get into showing off our knowledge. I've noticed in myself and in others how I find it enjoyable to tell other people what I know. I convince myself that people are impressed by my knowledge and grateful to be informed of it, when often they're just being polite and humouring me. We like it when people pay attention to us. Actually, I'm reiterating a theme in a talk I gave a few weeks ago. Some of you may have heard. It's a bit of a focus for me at the moment. And we crave their attention. It makes us feel wanted and loved. It affects the way we relate to others. We need to learn to give attention rather than to seek it, to be true spiritual adults. Not operate so much in the mode of telling people what we know rather than inquiring about them. Because the question, how are you, is an example of enlightened thought and action, inquiring after someone else and earnestly listening to them carefully, giving them the opportunity to talk, is a more mature and enlightened way of being. It's essential that we're willing to acknowledge when we receive information which proves that we're wrong. It's easy to get into denial mode when our knowledge is challenged. It feels like a slap in the face to find out that we're actually mistaken. We don't like that feeling, so we fight against it by carrying on regardless. So knowledge can be an obstacle, a barrier to us relating to others and to deepening our understanding of what reality is, what our responsibility in life is. And the third of those points, wanting nothing, that's perhaps the most easy to understand from our perspective, because we know the second noble truth says selfish desire or craving is the cause of suffering. It's well known that greed is, when acted on, divides us from others, causes arguments and conflict. If we don't train with it, that we end up repeatedly breaking the precept on taking that which is not given. That's why it's so much stressed in Buddhist practice to control or let go of our desires. Though, of course, there is the correct use of desire, which is why I like to draw a distinction between desire and greed or craving. The desire to help others, which is something we all experience, or the desire for enlightenment, nothing wrong with those. But when our desire becomes pathological, when it becomes greed or craving, then that's when it becomes a cause of suffering. Now, the description in the quote about being free as the day he was prior to the entry into his mother's womb, that's a bit puzzling, isn't it? That's kind of not a situation you want to aim for, as if you could even. What it's alluding to, of course, is the state of being unaffected by worldly concerns, which you are if you're not yet born. It reminds us of the line from the Most Excellent Mirror Samadhi, which goes, "A baby of this world is such as this, possessing all his 5 sense organs," etc. Describing a state of being unconditioned, spontaneous, and not affected by culture or ingrained habits, which again is a feature of the newly born or not yet born. It's not, of course, that we should become childish, but more open-hearted, like babies and children usually are before they become influenced by worldliness. So what is it about the condition of... Excuse me, I've become detached from one of my wires. The condition of having nothing, knowing nothing, and wanting nothing, which makes it useful for us to study and to practice. Well, it describes a very pure kind of meditation. It exemplifies being in the place of non-attachment, of holding on to nothing, which is a position from which we can act with freedom, unencumbered by opinions and habits and the influence of our own partiality. In other words, when we have nothing, know nothing, and want nothing, we are free to do whatever is good or right, rather than what we've learned to do, which may be okay, but often it's not the best way, because we learn bad habits in the course of growing up. Though, of course, having, wanting and knowing nothing is only ever in this moment. If we aim to be in the present moment, having nothing, knowing nothing and wanting nothing, then we are in meditation. And then we take the next step, whatever we need to do in life. If we need to draw on our knowledge in a given situation, of course that's fine to do that. It's not that we reject or disclaim all knowledge. We just don't let it become fixed. And we all need things, possessions, to survive and to function. So having, for instance, a home and possessions is not wrong. Just it's good to be aware that ownership is only ever temporary and an expedient by which we can go about our lives doing good for others. And being in this place of having, knowing and wanting nothing takes bravery. It's easier to cling to knowledge and possessions, but once you realize they are not a true refuge, which happens when you meditate, you see that that's the case, then the practice becomes clear to not hold on to those things. And just going back to Meister Eckhart and his unpopularity with the established church at the time, it was caused by his teaching and understanding being beyond that of the authorities. He encouraged, as I suggested earlier, his students to go beyond doing the will of God and not to get stuck with limiting concepts, which always happens when you try to formulate or define a practice or a deity. In this respect, this giving up everything that he was practicing, he was in accord with Dogen, whose writings, with its paradoxes and multiple negations, forces us to let go of whatever we grasp onto. It's uncomfortable, disorienting even, but his aim is to help us keep open to learning ever more deeply what reality is. Now, if you were to tell the average person that knowing nothing is the highest wisdom, they'll probably think you're bonkers. And that's because, of course, they don't know the mind of meditation. And if you tell them having nothing is the way to fulfillment, you'll probably get the same response. You will want to share with them what you have found, but you can't transfer your understanding to somebody else. They have to be open enough to find out for themselves. So that's why we generally don't tend to engage in conversations with people who aren't training in the way that we are about paradoxical teachings like that. The Buddha's way isn't easy to find, not easy to understand, which is why we trainees are a minority. The way of Zazen is subtle and profound, and we're indeed fortunate to have found it. All we can do is to continue to walk the path so that the benefits can be manifested in the world and hopefully seen by those who have the eyes to see.